Hey everyone. Today we are going to be talking about our endocrine system. So our goals today are to talk about major functions and characteristics of hormones that we find. We're going to be mostly talking about vertebrates with a little bit of inverts at the end. Talk about the major endocrine glands, the mammalian stress response, and again, a little bit of differences between our vertebrate and our invertebrate groups. All right, so our endocrine system is all of our hormones. And a hormone is defined here as this chemical substance that's going to exert some kind of a regulatory influence on a structure or a function. So that's a pretty broad definition, and it turns out that hormones can look really different and they can act really differently depending on what kind of hormone we are talking about. So these can be released either by a non-neural endocrine cell, so one that's not part of the nervous system, or it can end up being released by a neuron. And overall, hormones are incredibly powerful. And even just like having small disruptions in hormones can cause some pretty big negative effects on physiology in general. So our hormones are responsible for a lot of the things that go on within our bodies. So they're responsible for helping to maintain homeostasis, which of course we know is one of the driving principles of animal physiology. They're responsible for regulating growth and development, and of course they are really important within reproductive processes as well. And there's some pictures. All right, so the way that these hormones are going to work, they act as these signals throughout the body. So the goal is for them to be released in one place, for them to move through the body to get to another place in order to deliver a message. So the way that this typically looks is going to be following this process here. So it's going to be transported via the circulatory system, and it's going to bind to a really specific receptor that's going to be found on the organ that it's targeting. So just like our neurotransmitters, you have to have a really specific shape in order to fit within that receptor. And it doesn't take much. The body only needs to produce a really small amount of hormones to ultimately have an effect on that target organ. So often our hormones are going to be regulated by feedback loops. Remember we talked about these very early on. We have both positive and negative feedback loops that are going to drive our hormones. And often these loops can be incredibly complex. So this diagram over to the right, I know it's pretty difficult to read there. It's in really small print. But what it is showing is a bunch of arrows. And these arrows are starting up on top in the hypothalamus within our brain and cascading down through all these different types of hormones to different structures. And these are loops that you're seeing. When there's a plus, this is a positive loop. When it's a minus, it's a negative type of a loop to ultimately continue to send these signals. So you can see that there's both positive and negative when we're looking at signals that are being sent out there from the hypothalamus. So looking at the structures of hormones here, there's three major types that you can have. You can be a steroid hormone, which is going to be our testosterones and our estrogens. You can be a peptide or a protein hormone. Examples of this are insulin and growth hormone. You can also be an amine hormones. These are going to be like melatonin, which can make you sleepy, epinephrine, norepinephrine, which are going to contribute to that fight or flight response. So these end up having slightly different biochemical structures. Of course, our amines are just these single amino acids. The peptides are going to be big chains of amino acids. So our hormones end up being really closely linked to our nervous system. In fact, some physiologists would argue that the nervous system is the most important endocrine organ that we have because that link is so tight. So some hormones are going to actually be released by neural cells, and these are called neurohormones. Basically, it's really similar to what's happening with those neurotransmitters. And you're going to end up with terminals in capillaries that are ready to capture that specific hormone that you're looking for. So, of the functions that are driven by hormones, most of them are going to be. So, we have digestion, which is, of course, responsible for metabolism. We have osmoregulation. So our ion balance and our water balance are going to be controlled by hormones. Calcium metabolism, growing morphological changes, and then, of course, we have reproduction. So over to the right are the major organs that are going to be responsible for making these different types of hormones. And we're going to talk more about each of these. And specifically what they end up producing hormone-wise. All right, so starting with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is part of our brain, and the hypothalamus ends up having a lot of like top-down control over our other hormones. So in that complicated diagram a few slides ago, that top bar was the hypothalamus, and then all the other hormones were cascading underneath of it. So this ends up being the major driver here in the brain to say what needs to happen within the rest of the body. And then off of the hypothalamus, there's the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland has two parts to it. There is the anterior pituitary and there is the posterior pituitary. And these two different parts of the pituitary gland, they end up making different types of hormones. So you can see that when we look at different classes within the animal kingdom, starting with our lampreys and hagfish down at the bottom there, moving into our chondrichthyes, actinopterygians, amphibians, and mammals, we see a really similar brain structure here. Sure, it looks different, but even our lampreys, which are like, they're barely vertebrates, they are going to have the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland within there. The intermediate lobe is just, it's like a division point between those two structures. So you can see that changing quite a bit as well throughout the different classes. But the takeaway message here is that it's here throughout evolutionary history. So starting by looking at our posterior pituitary here. The posterior pituitary is only responsible for two hormones. ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. So we're going to talk about both those. ADH, the antidiuretic hormone, is responsible for ultimately producing vasopressin. And this is going to limit urine production. So this is the hormone that is telling your body to hang on tight to that water, that you need this for your cellular functions and you don't quite have enough. Don't just pee it all out, hang on tight to it. And then oxytocin is responsible for a few different things. Oxytocin is responsible for producing uterine contractions when mammals are in labor. It's responsible for milk production, and it is also responsible for bonding in animals. So oxytocin as a bonding hormone is really interesting. And there's been quite a bit of work that has been done looking at oxytocin in voles. And the reason for that is that there are these two types of voles. We have prairie voles and we have meadow voles. And they look really, really similar to each other. They occupy really similar ecological niches. But the prairie vole bonds for life, and the meadow vole does not. And it turns out that this is driven by some differences in oxytocin receptors in the brain. Whereas the meadow vole does not have as many receptors, they don't form that social bond like the prairie voles do, which is quite interesting. So here's a video that I'm going to let you all just watch on your own time, but this explains a little bit of the science behind that prairie vole bonding. All right, so the anterior pituitary is actually responsible for a whole lot more than the posterior pituitary gland is. So here we have follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. We have thyroid stimulating hormone. We have adrenocorticotropin hormone, prolactin, melanin stimulating hormone, and then growth hormone. All of these things are coming from the anterior pituitary. So it's an incredibly important organ when it comes to hormone functioning. All right, so we're going to zoom in on each of those components just a little bit here. So starting with our reproductive functions here. So the anterior pituitary is responsible for follicle stimulating hormone and for luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone is what's going to stimulate the growth of an ovarian follicle. So this is actually forming that egg. And luteinizing hormone is going to trigger the release of that egg and causing ovulation in our animals. So over to the right, I have two different reproductive cycles. Looking at the key, the solid blue bar is luteinizing hormone. The yellow bar is follicle stimulating hormone. The blue with white in the middle is estrogen, and then the dotted yellow line is progesterone. So these are two different animals. The top is a human's reproductive cycle, and the bottom one is a rat's reproductive cycle. So you can look at these two different cycles, and you can tell that they have quite different kinds of cycles. So a typical human female cycle is like an average of 28 days. A typical rat cycle is 4 days. So they can have a lot of offspring. You can look at some bigger animals and see pretty wild cycles, like elephants are only receptive to, they only ovulate a few times a year maximum, similar with rhinos. So you've got to be really, really careful to hit that window if you actually want any kinds of offspring there. So in terms of testosterone, testosterone gets kind of a bad rep. And testosterone tends to get lumped into really aggressive behaviors. There's a lot of rumors that like a bull shark that we have up in the right or left hand, I don't know what, my left hand corner there, have exceptionally high levels of testosterone. And it turns out that that's not actually true. That was like one blood pool that had high testosterone, and that's not necessarily why they're such an aggressive species. And it turns out that in order for testosterone to really be a driver in aggression, there has to be kind of some component of social instability that goes with that as well. So this could be things like a dominance hierarchy. It could be protecting territory. It might be access to mates. But like just testosterone on its own isn't necessarily going to make someone like super aggressive as an individual. All right, so the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland has gotten a lot of attention in people because it's a driver in metabolism, and it's sort of one of the leading causes of people having metabolic issues. And it can look two different ways. You can have hypothyroidism, where you have like a sluggish thyroid. It's not producing the hormones like it should be. And some symptoms of this are going to be being really tired, weight gain, cold intolerance is part of this too. And then on the other end, you can have an overactive thyroid, and this is hyperthyroidism. So you're going to have too many thyroid hormones pumping through your body. So these people often feel really nervous and don't sleep well. They lose weight, they lose hair. And this image over to the right is showing a goiter, which is not something that we tend to see much anymore medically, but they used to be relatively common. And this is like a big swelling and growth over the thyroid gland. And one of the leading causes of a goiter was an iodine deficiency. And the reason that we had iodine deficiencies in this country is because soils in the Midwest were particularly deficient in iodine, so people just weren't getting the nutrient. But if you've ever noticed, take a look at your salts, like your big thing of Morton salts when you're at home, and likely you will see that it is supplemented with iodine. And the reason for that is it was actually a government initiative to add iodine into salt so we could prevent this medical condition. All right, so these adrenal glands are a big component in metabolism and in stress response. So the adrenal gland is broken down into two components. There is the adrenal cortex, which is the outer area of the adrenal gland. So this is responsible for metabolizing carbohydrates, fats. It's responsible for maintaining a proper electrolyte balance and proper hydration levels in the body. And then the adrenal medulla, which is going to be the inner area. This is a big component of the sympathetic nervous system. So this is part of our fight or flight response, where we're going to get adrenaline and noradrenaline created in this medulla. Now, in terms of the pancreas is going to create insulin, which is a really important molecule for carbohydrate metabolism because it allows for our cells to take up glucose. This is another place where we see some issues arising in human physiology with both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is what it's showing on the left here. This is actually an autoimmune condition. It's often diagnosed pretty early in life. If it doesn't end up getting diagnosed, it is fatal. And what happens is the body actually attacks its own beta cells that produce insulin. So the body isn't producing insulin the way that it should because of this autoimmune condition. Type 2 diabetes is usually diagnosed later in life. This is not an autoimmune condition. This is one that tends to be driven more by a poor diet. Often people will say it's because of a high sugar diet, and there's more research that's coming out now to say that consuming a lot of animal fats, so dairy and meat and eggs, that's actually going to be a driver in type 2 diabetes, maybe even more than sugar is. But basically, you do damage to the pancreas where it can't produce insulin. And this is called insulin resistance. And because of this, the cells then still can't have that uptake of glucose. All right, so let's go back to that adrenal gland and talk a little bit about the mammalian stress response. I don't know about you guys, but I bet you're feeling like this is a little personal right now. I'm stressed out. I bet you're stressed out too. But let's talk a little bit about this in terms of physiology, what is happening. So stress is often labeled as a bad thing. And when it is chronic, it's not good. But stress is also adaptive. We have a stress response because it allows us to survive in really hairy situations. And it does this through a few different mechanisms. So we're going to have increase in heart and breathing rates. My heart's pounding like all the time now, which isn't particularly helpful because I can't outrun COVID-19. But if you are a prey animal and you are trying to outrun a predator, by increasing your heart and breathing rate, you're going to increase the amount of blood flow and oxygen that you're able to get to your muscles. So metabolic processes release stored energy. This too is going to allow you to operate at an optimal level for a short period of time. Oxygen nutrients are directed to your central nervous system, so you're able to think really quickly for a little bit. Your brain's getting a lot of oxygen nutrients, so you can make some quick decision making. And often non-necessary processes are going to be curtailed for the time. So feeding and reproduction, you're often, when you're really, really stressed in a moment, not very hungry. It's because you're not having a lot of blood flow to your gut in the moment. You're more worried about running away than you are about having a meal. All right, so chronic stress. This is stress for more than just a moment, right? This is when you are constantly having a stress response. So this is not adaptive for long periods of time. My hair is actually falling out like these zebra stripes are. Like next time you see me, I'm gonna be a little bit bald. So that is a real side effect of chronic stress. Your body starts to let go of things that aren't immediately necessary because, like, why feed the hair when, like, you're dying? That's what your body thinks might happen if you don't have a response. So muscle wasting is something that can happen from chronic stress. Bone thinning, a suppression of the immune system, so you're more likely to get sick when you are chronically stressed. Atrophy of neurons, so your brain starts to fall apart when you're chronically stressed. Man, I'm feeling this one too. I seem to have totally lost my short-term memory. Like, I'm constantly turning to do a thing and I forget all the time. So please email me when I have forgotten to do that thing that I'm going to forget to do. So this is a TED Ed too on how stress affects your immune system. I'm gonna let you watch this one on your own time as well. All right, but let's take a look at this. So this is a big, hairy diagram, but we can take our time and deconstruct this. One of the first big takeaway messages of this is that we have both a nervous system response and an endocrine response that are a part of this stress response. And they're equally important when it comes to the actual physiology of what's happening in the body here. So let's start over by looking at the nervous system response. So what you're going to have here is that activation of your sympathetic nervous system here. And that will be through the neurotransmitters norepinephrine and epinephrine. So from that, we have some psychological effects here. We have an increase in alertness. We have some more blood going to that amygdala and the hippocampus in order to actually remember what's happening so we can learn and not make potentially the same mistake in the future. And in terms of the physiological effects from this activation of the sympathetic nervous system, you're going to have things like this increase in heart rate, increase in breathing rate, vasoconstriction. That's going to be constriction of the vessels within certain areas of the body, and that's so that you can divert blood to areas that need the blood the most. Decrease in digestion, increase in glucagon here, we're releasing energy from the body, increase in the fat catabolism, and a decrease in insulin here because we're actually going to grab stored glucose from muscle and the liver. And then over on this side, we're starting with our endocrine response. And this is going to begin in the hypothalamus. And CRH stands for corticotropin releasing hormone. So that's going to be our first trigger. And that CRH is then going to go down to our anterior pituitary, where it's going to cause a release of ACTH, which is our adrenocorticotropin hormone. That's ultimately going to cause the release of glucocorticoids, which are a steroid hormone that is then going to target different parts of the body. So we've got all kinds of stuff going on here. The big takeaway is mostly this release of energy in order to continue to be able to have that stress response here. So again, it's big message is there's nervous system response, there's endocrine response, and these two together are ultimately going to drive the stress response that allows you to complete the tasks that were outlined on the previous slide. So when it comes to chronic stress and looking at the animal kingdom, there's some different stories to be told here. There's a base of literature that was done looking to see how dominance hierarchies affect stress levels. And these were first done in labs with what was called winner-loser studies, and mostly it was done with mice and rats. And they would pit two individuals against each other. The winner would then be called the dominant one, the loser would be the subordinate one. And they would measure their stress hormones. And what they found was that the subordinate one had higher levels of stress hormones than the dominant one in that scenario. But the reality is that's not how things tend to go in social animals. Usually it's not strangers in an enclosed area that then have to fight. It's a lot more nuanced than that. So there's another body of literature that looked at a group of animals called cooperative breeders. And cooperative breeders are a unique group of animals where only the dominant individuals are allowed to reproduce, and then the rest of that social group is dedicated to raising the offspring of this dominant animal. So there's two examples up here right now. We have our African wild dogs and dwarf mongoose. And when they looked at the stress hormones in these animals, they found a opposite story. where the dominant animals actually had higher stress hormones than our subordinate animals did. And the thought behind that is that the dominant animals ultimately have a lot to lose if they have a shift in social status. So in order to maintain that social status, they're kind of like constantly working at it, and that's actually a really stressful position for them to be in. And this would explain why there's often shifts in dominance hierarchies, because an animal can't always maintain that chronic level of stress throughout their whole life. All right, so everything we've done thus far has been really vertebrate focused. I'm going to just like barely even touch on the invertebrates. Um, with our invertebrates, we're of course looking at simpler animals than we are with the vertebrates. They tend to have less endocrine glands and use more neurohormones instead of glands. And the way that this actually works within the body is going to increase as we move from our platyhelminthes up into our arthropods. So the arthropods, they undergo often different life stages, and hormones are going to drive these big changes in metamorphosis. Um, So in invertebrates, in the arthropods specifically, we're calling these hormones ectosteroids, and they're derived from ecdysone. And they're going to be the driving hormone when it comes both to reproduction and development, and also in molting, in order for them to move to these different stages. So another important hormone with our arthropods is juvenile hormone. And juvenile hormone is responsible for these big moments in metamorphosis. And so it can be detected in hemolymph, so they're analogous blood to ours, and it's regulating development there. So if you look at this graph, we have juvenile hormone level on the y-axis, and then these different developmental stages on the x. And the purple line is showing the shift in juvenile hormone. So you can see it's quite high when they're in caterpillar stage, and then there's a big old drop when they become a pupa. And then it's going to slowly increase again in order to go through that developmental stage to become a butterfly. All right, so that lands us at the end of this lecture on the endocrine system. We will pick up next time talking about some thermal physiology. Until then, I hope that you are all staying healthy and staying sane. See you soon.